The poet Hafiz wrote, even after all this time, the sun never says to the earth, you owe me. Even after all this time, the sun never says to the earth, you owe me. Look what happens with a love like that. It lights up the sky. In Paul's letter to the Corinthians, he is teaching us how we can light up the sky. He writes, each of you must give as you have made up your mind, not regretfully or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. Now, this is a challenge for sure, but I think it's an invitation. It's an invitation into that great mystery of life that those of us who learn to give generously not only touch upon God's joy, but our deepest joy. This fall on Tuesday mornings, we've been reading the Book of Joy, a heart-to-heart conversation between two of the most joyful human beings on the planet, the Dalai Lama and Archbishop Desmond Tutu, two of the most unlikely people to be joyful given their history. The Dalai Lama has been living in exile as a refugee for 5 decades, and Desmond Tutu lived through the horrors of apartheid. But we've been learning a lot about joy, and one of the things that we've been learning is that there is a joy that we can discover that is not contingent upon the circumstances of our lives, of things going the way we want them. Maybe you're familiar with this landmark study, but there was a study years ago of people who won the lottery. And wouldn't you know that the people who won the lottery were no more happier than people who were paralyzed for life by an accident. Think about that. Now, we know from research that maybe about 50% of happiness is tied to factors beyond our control, but there's a whole other half of the recipe for happiness that is within our control. Now, we can't control the things that happen, but we can control how we respond to the things that happen. And it turns out that our attitude, our actions, our practices are significant in our lives in terms of bringing happiness into our life. So that's what I want to talk about today, because there is much that is within our control as human beings when it comes to happiness. Psychologist Sonia Lyubomirsky has been studying the science of happiness ever since she graduated from Stanford in 1994, and she has identified through her research 3 keys to happiness. The first is the ability to reframe things positively. I'm not going to talk about that today, although I think Jesus is getting at that in the text from Luke, but that's a whole other sermon. The second is the ability to practice gratitude. I want to talk about that. And the third is the choice to be kind and generous. I think both of those ideas, gratitude and generosity, can be found in the texts that we read today and can be found throughout our Judeo-Christian tradition. Anthony DeMello tells a story about a group of tourists who are in a bus, and they are driving through the most gloriously beautiful terrain, country with lakes and mountains, green fields and rivers, and there's one problem. The shades of the bus are pulled down, and they can't see the beauty all around them, and they are captivated and captured by a desire to get the best seat in the bus and to seem like the most important person in the bus. And how often are our lives captivated by this kind of work, and we miss all the beauty around us. John Wooden used to say, happiness begins when selfishness ends. And do you know one person who's selfish in your life who's happy? Can you think of one human being who's selfish and happy? I think when we learn the practices of gratitude and generosity, we pull. Can I get an amen? When we practice gratitude and generosity, we pull up the shades and we begin to see how blessed we are. Let's go to this mic. We begin to see how blessed we are and how generous this God is and the abundance that we live in. Indian billionaire Ratanji Tata has gone through what he describes as the 4 stages of happiness. The first stage was making a lot of money, and he made a lot of money. He's a billionaire, more than probably all of us combined this man has made. He accumulated all these resources, but he discovered it didn't lead him to happiness. The second stage was he became a collector of valuable things. He would get the most beautiful and precious things in the world, but the problem was the effect of every purchase seemed to diminish just as quickly as he purchased the next thing. And this too did not lead to happiness. The third stage he described as getting the big project at work, and he got not one project, but 2 of the biggest projects that you could get. He ended up controlling 95% of the diesel production, the diesel supply in Africa and India. And he also became the owner of the largest steel factory, not only in India, but in all of Asia. But even with all this money and all these things and all this power at his fingertips, he still was not happy. And then one day his friend asked him whether he would help buy 200 wheelchairs for these disabled children. And then he added another request, and will you come with me to hand out these wheelchairs to the children? And he agreed, and so he started to hand out these wheelchairs to these children of need. And he began to recognize how happy these children were. He saw a glow on their faces as they sat in the wheelchairs, and as they moved those wheelchairs around, as they came up with different games that they could play now that they were mobile, and he felt profound happiness. And that experience was beautiful, but it didn't change him. What changed him was what happened next. When he was about to leave, he was headed to the exit, and he realized there was a kid tugging on his leg. He tried to shake the kid off, kept holding on even tighter. He looked down at the kid. He said, "What do you need?" And the kid looked up at him. He locked eyes. He said, "I just want to remember your face, so when I meet you again in heaven, I'll know your name and I can say thank you again." And he discovered the 4th stage, genuine happiness. Genuine happiness. William Blake said, "Gratitude is heaven itself." Gratitude is heaven. He was in heaven. He tasted heaven. He glimpsed heaven. And that undid him and transformed him for the better. He discovered that it isn't happiness that makes us grateful, it's gratitude. Gratitude that makes us happy. And what's so exciting about the times that we're living in, this isn't just a spiritual, existential truth. We now know it's a scientific fact that gratitude increases our happiness. And the third key, she says, is to choose to be kind and generous. Khalil Gibran, author of The Prophet, wrote, "You often say, 'I would give, but only to the deserving.' The trees in your orchard, they don't say that. The flocks in your pasture, they don't say that. They give that they may live, for to withhold is to perish," which is what our sacred text teaches us in the book of Proverbs. It says, "Some give freely, yet grow all the richer. So others withhold what is due and suffer only want. For generosity begets generosity," as Paul teaches. Charles Eisenstein, American author and teacher, points out that every culture has a story for their world. And the story is a weaving together of myths and meanings, narratives, words, symbols, rituals, and agreements that together define our world. The story, which we all inherit, is hard to see. It's kind of like, we're fish in the water and we can't see the water. We can't always see the story, so we need others to point it out. And once we hear about it and start to see it, we see it everywhere. It teaches us who we are. It teaches us how to be human. It teaches us what is real, what is sacred, and what our purpose here on earth is. In the West, Eisenstein writes, the dominant story has been this one, the story of separation. The story of separation. From an early stage, we are taught that we are distinct human beings, distinct individuals. And so we begin to see ourselves as separate from each other. If you've held an infant recently, you'll know that they don't yet see themselves distinct. But we do. And we start to see ourselves separate from one another, separate from creation, separate from nature and all of the natural forces in the world. In the story of separation, trust does not happen easily. For everything, the world, its people, nature itself, even human nature is an adversary that we either have to overcome or insulate ourselves from or find some way to dominate and control, because there is no sense of a larger intelligence beyond ourselves or a purpose outside of ourselves. And so sadly, trust is hard to come by in this story, and so is giving. Giving becomes unnatural in this story. For if I am separate from you and you are separate from me, then I begin to think if I have more, you're going to have less. If I have less, you're going to have more. It's this zero-sum game that poses as reality in our culture and in our world. And so that story has a profound impact on all of us. And there isn't this sense that we're created by a generous God to be generous, and that giving is the most natural thing that we can do as human beings. And becoming a good person in this story involves a sort of conquest, a conquest of the self and our natural selfishness, which is what this story teaches us. It all sounds tragically sad, doesn't it? It seems like a prison that we can never get out of. But here's the good news. We've been telling a different story as part of the Judeo-Christian tradition from the very beginning. And here's the even better news for the times that we're living in. The story we know now is simply untrue. There is so much of science that is debunking this story, making it obsolete. Whether you look at genetics or physics or biology, we are learning that order emerges spontaneously out of chaos. We are learning that the well-being of one is inseparable from the well-being of all. We are learning that we are not separate. We never have been. And it's an impossibility to live separate lives. Eisenstein argues there's a new story that is emerging. He calls it the story of interbeing. I call it the gospel. I call it our story, the story that we've inherited. Here's how he describes it. The world and everything in it is a gift. We did not earn our lives. We did not earn the sun. It is not thanks to our hard efforts that the sun shines. No. We did not earn the ability of plants to grow. We did not earn water. We did not earn our conception. We did not earn our breath. Our hearts beat and our livers metabolize on their own. Life is a gift. But that old storyline has its claws in all of us. It doesn't want to let us go. And so you're probably thinking, well, I've worked hard. I deserve what I have. And perhaps you have worked hard. I'm sure you have. And I'm sure you're still working hard. But where does that strength to work hard come from? Where does that creativity come from? Where does that intelligence come from? Does it really begin with you? Does it really begin with me? Isn't it possible that we're riding around with the shades down and we're not seeing reality very clearly? What would it be like to open those shades again? To be free from the prison of selfishness, to see clearly what is always and eternally true, that life is a gift. And it is on loan to us for a period of time. Thomas Merton wrote a lot about this, what he called the illusion of separateness. And here's what he said. He said that we are already one. We began the call to worship today with those beautiful words. We are one. We are. But we imagine we're not. And that's the tragedy. That's the tragedy of the story of separation. So what are we to do? Here's what Merton says. What we must recover is our original unity. What we have to be is what we are. Doesn't have to be hard. What we have to be is what we are. That's a better story. That's a more truthful story of what this life is about. Which brings us back to Hafiz. Even after all this time, the sun never says to the earth, "You owe me." Look what happens with a love like that. It lights up the sky. Look what happens to a family committed to that idea. It lights up the family. Look what happens to a church committed to that generosity. It lights up the community. Look what happens to a nation that realizes its service is to the world. It's a light to all nations. Look what happens to us when we lift those shades and we see how generous God is, and we join God in expressing our generosity in the smallest ways that we can. It lights up the sky. So let's light the sky together.